Hello, Christian Ethics class. This is Professor Opterbeck, and welcome to week 5 of Christian Theological Ethics. I think it is appropriate for us to just pause for a moment and even as an online learning community, remember the events that happened in Las Vegas. This is the kind of thing for me as someone who's interested in philosophical theology, and one of the core kind of questions is the problem of evil, to which we just don't really have any satisfactory answer other than just pointing to the cross and hoping that we as participants in God's mission in the world can, at least in some small way, have have an influence in maybe mitigating and ministering where these kind of things happen. So having acknowledged that, let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing in class. So last week we introduced the rubric that our textbook authors are using of universal, ecclesial, and subversive ethics, and we spent a good amount of time talking about universal ethics and about the categories of deontological ethics and of consequentialism or utilitarianism and other kinds of versions of universal ethics. And we had some really great discussions. I think one of the things that came out of the discussions this week is perhaps the difficulty of really specifying what universal ethics might mean. So if your inclination, your ethical approach is to say that there must be some kind of absolute norm, and I do think, as Christian thinkers, we ultimately are going to say that. I mean, even if you fall in a bucket of Christian ethics of more on the ecclesial side or maybe more on the subversive side, you ultimately likely are going to say, but all of this points to the God who made us. And it's more of a question of sort of what we're able to discern and how we work that out and how we apply it. But either way, however we're ultimately going to approach it, I think one of the things we brought out in the discussion is if we want to even talk about something like natural law, it can be very difficult to figure out at what level we can discern that and then how that applies to specific circumstances. And I do hope the discussion sort of brought out the notion, which I think all of the classical natural law thinkers held, Aquinas, Augustine, many of the church fathers who would be inclined to some kind of natural law view, all agreed that we can determine some very broad general principles like the good ought to be done and evil ought to be avoided. But then applying that to specific circumstances actually can be very contingent. And there's nothing wrong with recognizing that. It's not a form of relativism. It just recognizes that human beings are situated, that we're culturally situated, we're historically situated, that circumstances change, and that the more and more we get to levels of detail on certain things, then it could be that the best way to apply it in one circumstance isn't the best way to apply it in another circumstance. And that just reflects the fact that we're human, that we're limited, that we're living in history, and further that we're living in a time in which the kingdom of God has not yet fully arrived, that it's breaking in, it's arriving, but we're still kind of in this tension between the times, and we have to deal with circumstances that are far less than perfect. Now, so having said that, I think that was some great discussion for last week. We are then going to move into another week of focusing on these issues of kind of categories, and we're going to spend some time particularly looking at ecclesial ethics and subversive ethics. We're going to look at a couple of my very, very favorite Christian thinkers this week, being Alasdair MacIntyre and Stanley Hauerwas. Now, I don't agree with everything MacIntyre says. I don't agree with everything Hauerwas says, but they both are thinkers who really have informed me and challenged me. They, as you will see, they largely fall into the ecclesial ethics camp. Without putting too many cards on the table, I think my inclinations are kind of a blend between universal and ecclesial with some of the subversive added in. But I really do appreciate how they focus on the fact that we're always doing ethics from a context, from a location, and that as Christians, we can't necessarily expect that the location from which we're doing ethics in the church is going to be a location that other parts of the world will immediately recognize. So I think that's really helpful. Subversive ethics as well, we have some readings from Gustavo Gutierrez, we have some discussion of liberation theology. It's really only in the past couple of years that I personally have done any serious reading in liberation theology. And again, there are aspects of it that I find troubling. There are aspects of it that I find really exciting and really interesting and very, very helpful. And at the very least, it's important for us to remember as we're thinking about these ethical categories to realize our own location and to try and see some of these issues from the location of people who might not be exactly like us. So that's what we're trying to do this week. I look forward again to some good discussion. As you'll see in the list of the lessons, we'll do that this week, and then next week we start to move headlong into some very specific issues, starting with the question of the relation of church and state. So once again, I will see you on the forums this week. Just a reminder, I'm grading as I go. So in general, where we've got 2 forums, the initial post is worth 70 points. When you've got 2 responsive posts in a forum, they're each worth 15 points, total of 30, adding up to 100 points for each forum. So if you see your grade being 70 or 65 or something, something like that, don't get alarmed. It's probably just because I've only gotten to grade the first forum. I'm trying to get through the responses sort of sometimes on Monday, but it might take me Tuesday or Wednesday to get through some of the responses, depending on what they look like and on my own schedule and so on. So I'll see you in the forums this week, and hope you have a good week.